As I was pondering what I wanted to talk about on the last episode of 2021, the thought occurred to me that, damn, this has been a really depressing year. Not much of anything went right, did it? This was supposed to be the year all of the COVID madness ended, or at least a lot of people naively thought it would. But if you were watching this program in December of last year, you heard your host make what turned out to be a regrettably accurate prognostication. That without mass public non-compliance, we would be in this exact same spot at the close of 2021, and so we are. I said there is no scenario where we can obey our way out of this thing and go back to our former lives, and so there hasn't been. So now we're back to everybody walking around like faceless zombies with their silly obedience muzzles on. At least that's how it is here in the People's Republic of California. We've had untold tens of thousands of people fired from their jobs for declining to undergo a medical treatment that they neither want nor need. Schools are getting shut down again. Colleges are going back to remote learning. Hockey games canceled. College football bowl games canceled. Including the Holiday Bowl here in San Diego, which was called off yesterday 4 hours before the scheduled kickoff, after upwards of $2 million had been spent dismantling Petco Park to accommodate a football field. So that's a lot of fun. And I began to wonder, in the midst of these ruminations, isn't there anything good and positive I can talk about that happened this year? Something that everybody can agree on? Anything? And yes, it turns out there is something like that. Although, if it had slipped one more week, 2021 would have been something close to a good news shutout. However, at long last, 14 years behind schedule, only 800% over budget, the James Webb Space Telescope finally launched on Christmas Day and is currently en route to its final destination at the L2 Earth-Sun Lagrange point, the mission having thus far proceeded nominally and without incident. So that, I think, is a bit of unambiguously good news that everybody can celebrate. Well, except for the fact that the telescope is still named after James Webb, so I suppose there are a few wokesters who have got a chapped ass over that, because you may remember there was a last-ditch effort about 6 weeks before the launch to change the telescope's name to something else, since James Webb was a white guy from the South and he ran NASA during the 60s, so obviously he must have been a filthy racist, right? And this, as so often happens, is where the members of the woke identitarian left, the same people who are always so very eager to lecture you and me about the true facts of American history, this is where they get punched in the dick by their own crippling ignorance of that same history. So yes, James Webb was indeed a white guy, and he was from the South. He even had an accent. And he was the administrator of NASA during the era of the Civil Rights Movement. But you know what else he was? He was a liberal Democrat and a racial progressive. On 15 July 1969, one day ahead of the launch of Apollo 11, Reverend Ralph Abernathy showed up at Cape Canaveral with a couple busloads of civil rights activists, and they threw a protest, the point of which was to ask, in that same reductive, overly simplistic way such questions are always asked, well, how come Whitey can spend $18 billion on these manned lunar missions when we've got all these poor black folks down here on Earth? And during the course of the morning, the word got to Jim Webb that this thing was taking place, and where most administrators in his position would have just sent some PR flack down there to deal with the agitators, Webb stopped what he was doing in the middle of the most important day of his entire life and career, and he went down there to speak personally to Abernathy and his people. Their entire exchange was caught on film for posterity, and it's appeared in several documentaries on the Apollo program. Mr. Webb listened politely to every word Reverend Abernathy had to say, and then when it was his turn to speak, he told Abernathy, I agree with everything you just said. He said that the Apollo program is being undertaken for the benefit of all Americans, not just the white ones. And then he said to Abernathy, I want you to hitch your wagons to our rockets, and everybody in the whole country can be uplifted by what we're hopefully going to achieve here in the next 14 days. Then he said he would be honored if Reverend Abernathy and 3 of his guests would come sit with him on the VIP stand and view the launch the next morning. And Abernathy accepted the offer. So yeah, Please do tell us some more about what an awful racist monster Jim Webb must have been. How we have to strip his name off this telescope because naming stuff after white guys, well, it's just bad. The NASA of today is so infected with end-stage wokesterism that when I heard about the effort to have the telescope renamed, I assumed it would be successful. I mean, can we really depend on any organ of the U.S. government in the year 2021 to stand up for the character and the reputation of a deceased white guy when he's under attack from black nationalist radicals? I didn't think we could. But NASA surprised me, and they held firm. And consequently, thankfully, I'm not sitting here reporting on the launch of the George Floyd Black Lives Matter Defund the Police Memorial Space Telescope. So thank heaven for small wonders, isn't that right, Jim Eagle? From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where each New Year's Eve we attempt to smash the Guinness record for horns of ale consumed. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I am your eponymous host and humble servant. And do you remember when the corpse of Joe Biden ran for president last year? Once he had become the presumptive Democrat nominee, and in so doing, proven that the party would rather run behind a 78-year-old semi-animated cadaver than behind a 78-year-old honest-to-God communist, do you remember how he positioned himself? I mean, positioned himself politically. I'm not talking about how he positions himself when he goes in for a good hair sniff. So, stop being such a bunch of wise asses, audience. But Joe Biden, as the 2020 Democrat Party presidential nominee, he had only two attributes as a candidate. At least, that was the way his handlers designed it. Number one, I'm a guy with a faintly detectable pulse whose name is not Donald Trump. And number two, I am the guy who's going to shut down the virus. He never gave us any specifics on his plan for shutting down the virus, but he was emphatic about the fact that he did have such a plan. And it was so much better than Trump's plan that if Joe had been the president in 2020, not one single American would have succumbed to the Kung flu. And that all struck me as pretty odd, right from the outset, as political messaging goes, because isn't it implicit in that narrative the claim that, well, sure, I could tell everybody right now what my brilliant secret plan is, but I'm not going to. So you'll just have to vote for me in order to find out what the plan is. And hey, if 100 or 200,000 more people die between now and the election, well, that is just the cost of politics. But make no mistake, said candidate Joe, every single death in this pandemic owes 100% to bad presidential policy. So if you want yourself and your loved ones to remain alive, you better get out there and pull that lever for former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr. of Delaware. Wait, did I say pull the lever? That's not right. I meant mail in that mail-in ballot. Because only domestic terrorist, white supremacist insurrectionists vote in person, obviously. And if you receive a duplicate ballot, I guess you better mail both of them in just to be safe. And if you receive a ballot for your dead grandma, go ahead and mail that one in too. You know it's what Nana would have wanted. You're not going to disenfranchise your poor dead Nana, are you, you bastard? So Biden goes on to win the election, allegedly. And his approval numbers on every conceivable question of presidential policy, they start out in fair to middling territory, but as it becomes increasingly clear to all observers that this man is semi-sentient at best and has trouble distinguishing his ass from a hole in the ground, and is an historically awful president by every metric, those numbers, they started cratering immediately. And even with the entire establishment news media doing yeoman's work propping up him and his administration, Joe didn't get any honeymoon of which to speak, at least not in terms of his poll numbers. But when you orient your entire campaign around the idea that you're going to shut down the virus and then you fail to do that or even to come close to doing it, you can expect your poll numbers to crater, and to crater badly, and there's no amount of fake news media gaslighting that's going to stop it. So by every metric of presidential approval, Biden currently sits underwater by at least double digits. The only exception to that rule, up until recently at least, was COVID policy, where he was somehow managing to ride something close to a 50-50 split for reasons that your host is powerless to fathom, because in a results-oriented world, There simply are no data which suggest Biden's COVID policies have been any sort of improvement over Trump's. But that's not important now. We're not here to explain the power of mass public self-delusion. There are plenty of other videos in which we've done that. The point here is that the day before yesterday, when Joe effectively threw up the white flag and declared his surrender to the virus, saying, "There's no federal solution. States got to handle it themselves," he was giving up on the one area of policy where he wasn't massively underwater by at least 10 points, which, as political calculations go, is a pretty strange move. If he's decided to tap out on COVID policy, to throw in the proverbial towel when that's the single area where his approval numbers are not unmitigatedly disastrous, wouldn't that seem to signal that he's giving up on his entire presidency? When he hasn't even reached the 1-year mark? We were in for an interesting 2022 in any event, but if the president has already reached the point of declaring himself a lame duck and playing out the string until they let him go home, that's going to make it all the more interesting. That means we're going to see a phenomenon in this midterm that we've never seen before, at least not in your host's living memory. As we know, it is an immutable historical fact, one which has never been contravened, that the president's party always loses seats in the midterm, even when the president is popular, even when he has considerable political coattails on which to ride, his party loses seats always. In the last midterm, the 2018 midterm, the Democrats thought they were going to pick up between 80 and 90 seats. And in the event, they picked up around 40, which was barely enough to establish a razor-thin majority. And that was a major victory for Trump. When your party only loses half as many seats as it was expected to lose, that tends to mean you've got a fairly popular president who's doing a pretty good job. But the fake news media, they didn't like that very much at all. You'd think they would grow accustomed to always being wrong about everything, but it never seems to happen. All throughout 2017, if you recall, every talking head moron on cable news was confidently asserting that by the time the 2018 midterm rolled around, Trump would be so unpopular, so politically toxic, that no Republican candidate in their right mind would want to be seen in the same room with him. And as with most other things, they got it spectacularly wrong. Trump went all over the country campaigning for GOP candidates that year, with the end result that his party lost fewer than half as many seats as they were expected to lose. But I think we're about to see, in the 2022 midterm, something much closer to what the news media predictions were for 2018, when they were talking about the world as they would like it to be rather than the world that actually exists. Joe Biden is an intensely, historically unpopular president. I know more presidential history than most people, and I don't know that there is any antecedent for an elected, allegedly, president's approval numbers crashing this badly before the 1-year mark. So the scenario that was predicted in 2018, insofar as, okay, unpopular, politically toxic president has got no coattails and nobody in his party wants to be seen anywhere near him, while it never materialized in the year they predicted it, it's pretty much guaranteed to materialize next year. How many Democrat incumbents, that is, the ones who haven't already run screaming for the exit, do you imagine are going to be calling up the White House next fall saying, "Hey, could you send Joe down here to give a stump speech for me?" The stock response is probably going to be, "Sorry, Joe can't make it." But would you settle for Kamala? Hello? Hello? Are you still on the line? I think this election is going to have a lot in common, frankly, with the 94 midterm, when Clinton was nowhere near as unpopular as Biden is currently, but he had overreached very badly in his first 2 years. And it's a theme that should strike us as pretty familiar today. Candidate runs as a centrist, spends the first half of his term trying to govern as a radical leftist. It pisses off the country, and the president's party pays a heavy price for it in the midterm. But the Democrats in 94 didn't think they were going to pay a heavy price. By that point, their party had been in control of the House for upwards of 30 years, and they had grown accustomed to it. They figured their control was permanent, that it was the natural order of things. Sure, the Republicans might win the White House sometimes, they might win the Senate occasionally, but the House, We would never lose the House, like that would ever happen. But then they did lose the House, and they lost it badly. And Bill Clinton all of a sudden started governing like a moderate Republican instead of a Bernie Sanders socialist. Hillary Clinton practically dropped off the face of the earth, relegated to the role of First Lady rather than the co-president title that she had previously bestowed on herself in a show of characteristic modesty. But it wasn't the duplicity of the first couple that made that result happen. At least, it wasn't the only reason. 1994 was a throw-all-the-bastards-out election, and that owed in large part to the congressional check bouncing scandal, which first broke in 92, and it affected that year's election to some degree, but 94 was when those chickens really came home to roost. The word incumbent became so toxic that incumbents began demanding the option of not being listed as incumbent on the ballot, and I think 2022, even though we're not actually in it yet, it's starting to feel quite a bit like 94 in terms of an election where the voters are mad as hell, they're not going to take it anymore. And anybody who has had a hand in the stupid, wrong-headed policies of the last 2 years can expect to be thrown out on their ass with extreme prejudice. The Democrats really only have one chance at mitigating the damage if they want to make 2022 just a bloodbath instead of a full-on vampire movie. And of course it is by extending the pandemic to the point where they can demand we have another mail-in election. So don't be surprised when that happens, because make no mistake, it's coming. It'll probably begin in earnest the third week of January, after they have milked the anniversary of the January 6th insurrection for every last drop they can squeeze out of it. They may not like the 4th of July very much, but according to what I'm hearing, they are planning on a real extravaganza for the anniversary of this Capitol riot, as if it's some sort of cherished national holiday, which should clue us into what their electoral strategy is going to sound like next year. You're going to hear a lot of hyperventilating by all the usual suspects along the lines of, "This is the most important election in the history of our democracy. If the Republicans win, the January 6th insurrectionists will be in control of the Congress. Oh no! And they're coming after your abortions too, so be afraid. Be very afraid. Either that, or use a freaking condom." So mark my words, these are going to be two of the two prongs of the Democrat strategy in next year. Prong one is, well, COVID still exists, so we better have a mail-in election again. And prong two is January 6th insurrectionists. I'm not a betting man, but if I was, I would be inclined to bet that Joe doesn't make it to the end of his term. I also would be inclined to suspect that Kamala Harris will be replaced as vice president in the next 12 to 18 months, because for all intents and purposes, she is a dumber, more annoying version of Spiro Agnew at this point. The only reason Nixon ever survived 1973 was because he had a VP whom everyone on both sides of the aisle viewed as a worse option. Once Agnew had been moved aside in favor of Jerry Ford, a longtime congressman respected by everybody who didn't have any desire to be the president, only then did Nixon become doomed. And I think we'll probably see a similar series of events in these next couple years. Everybody knows Joe Biden is a failed president who cannot be salvaged politically. Everybody knows Kamala Harris is a dim-witted diversity hire who would be even worse than Biden if she ascended to the top job. So let's revisit this video a year from tonight and see how I did on these prognostications, shall we? Also, the wildly overrated former football analyst John Madden died yesterday without ever having admitted that the holy roller was always an illegal forward lateral and always will be. I used to dislike Madden both because he was a Raider and because he was a wildly overrated football analyst, but since I no longer have a rooting interest in the NFL, except that I support whoever the Chargers are playing, now I only dislike him half as much. Last night, almost as a reflex action, I actually started arguing with some Raider fan in some comment thread about the holy roller. And there was a time when I would have spent the whole rest of the evening on that argument, but then I caught myself. And I realized I no longer have any reason to give a damn. So I was happy to concede the point and go on about my evening. And Harry Reid kicked the bucket too, which normally I wouldn't lament all that much, but I did think he did some valuable work in the last few years of his life, insofar as he became an advocate for full government disclosure on the matter of unidentified aerial phenomena, which is what we're supposed to call UFOs now, apparently. And so, having acknowledged this last-minute spate of celebrity bucket-kicking, we mercifully close the ledger on the year of our Lord 2021, which I trust you enjoyed just as little as I did. Unless you enjoy wearing face diapers and having to show your identity papers every goddamn place you go, in which case you probably thought it was the best year ever. I will see you next Monday, 3 January 2022. I have decided to forego doing a New Year's Eve episode since I think we will all have decidedly better things to do that night, like drinking our faces off and trying to forget the last 12 months ever happened. So until next year, thank you very much indeed for watching. Do not comply and get the hell off my lawn.